Priestley, Politics and an Inspector Calls. A talk which I hope will explore some of the contexts, political and social, around the play which has become not only a stalwart of most schools' study at GCSE or IGCSE level, but is widely regarded as one of the most influential plays of the middle of the 20th century. As background, Priestley was born in Bradford in 1894. His father, Jonathan, was a school teacher, and Priestley got from his father many of the nonconformist political views that dominated his work through his adult life. He was a man who was hugely concerned with social fairness and a sense of what was just and unjust in society, and would in time, by the late 1950s, actually become one of the founding members of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, a remarkable man with a long life, and a life which was given over to a large degree of wish to support those weak within society. The play itself was premiered in 1945, soon after completion, in Leningrad, not in London as Priestley had wished, and this is due to the fact actually that there were no theatres available in London following the Blitz and the duration of the Second World War. Priestley's translators in Russia were, however, able to arrange a premiere in Leningrad and shortly after that in Moscow. And the play then opened in London, not to great reviews, despite a strong cast led by Ralph Richardson and featuring also the young Alec Guinness, and was taken up throughout Europe. And interestingly, after the war, both East and West seemed to find much in the play to admire, and it was very popular in Germany, particularly during the late 40s and early 50s. It's a fascinating play, and it's a play in which Priestley develops many of the ideas that he'd been looking at earlier in his writing career to do with time, and also to do with the idea that there is always a possibility, a time of change, in which if one recognises the practicality, if one recognises the need for change, society could be influenced for the better. That said, it also bears hallmarks and features of the medieval mystery plays, and we'll discuss all this in due course. So, around the same time as writing the play, Priestley, in Bradford, looked back in 1946 at his time of growing up in a novel called Bright Day. This is a relatively fond reminiscence of the time. It's full of Edwardian plenty and prosperity for many, a sense of freedom and a sense of how it was to live before the horrors of the war. That said, it's not clear of the realities of life then. This was a very divided world, the Edwardian world, and Priestley, in a city like Bradford, with huge industry, particularly in the cotton industry in the city, was well aware of the social deprivation being suffered by many, in fact the majority, of those living in the city. And this is a theme which became vital to Priestley as his career went on. He is also very concerned with the concept of marriage. He'd written a play about marriage with three couples who, during the course of what is a comedy, find themselves not actually to be married, was premiered in 1937. But also to look at, and particularly in this play, the social status within marriage. The idea that the social blight, if you like, of inequality transferred itself into marriage, and in Inspector Calls we see that very clearly with the way that Arthur Burling is of a lower social status than his wife. He spends most of the play trying to make up to her in some way, trying to fit what she requires of him, whilst at the same time seeking to aggrandize himself because of his position of power within society. Now, that's one aspect of marriage that Priestley was interested in. The other is the aspect of male domination of women, and this is again something that he wrote about at length during his life, the idea that he could see the utter hypocrisy of the wealthy classes, the mill owners, the business captains, who, whilst going to church on a Sunday and being filled with all sorts of religious zeal perhaps at the time, on the Saturday night had probably been drinking heavily in the company of women that they treated with no respect whatsoever. And we see this in Act 2 of Inspector Calls, in the short Alderman Meggetty section of the play. Sybil Burling is shocked that Alderman Meggetty should be accused in such a way, yet it's very obvious, and particularly from Sheila, it's very obvious that everybody in the town knows that Meggetty is a man of appalling moral behaviour. Now, Priestley grew up in an educated and relatively prosperous home. He went to Cambridge, and the fact that he had seen much of society before he left for Cambridge had not at this stage crystallised into what would become his later writing. It took the great catastrophe of the First World War to do this. When war was declared in 1914, Priestley immediately volunteered. He entered the army as a private soldier. He left it in 1918 as an officer. You could argue, and people will say, that Priestley was not physically damaged by the war. He managed to survive the war. He was, however, gassed on numerous occasions and was even buried alive twice following attacks on his trench and needing to be dug out. The war left him scarred mentally, if not physically, and also gave him an awareness of the pain and suffering and wastage of human life that terrible war led to. He was very clear, writing about the war in a memoir written in 1962, that he viewed the commanding elements of the British Army as he said, having a special talent to waste human life and to destroy these young lives. He also commented in the same work that the war had indeed left him with a great chip on his shoulder. He was very honest about that. And he commented, somewhat sardonically, that if there was a chip on his shoulder, it was probably the thigh bone of one of his comrades. When the war was over, nothing would be the same again. Priestley found it impossible, really, to return to Bradford. There were too many obvious signs of what had got lost. Bradford, as many cities, was a city which had recruited using PALS battalions for much of the war, and the point of the PALS battalion was to keep local men together, a sense of comradeship. The result of this, of course, was entire swathes of any city, and particularly those cities in the industrial northwest, where whole streets, whole areas would suddenly have their young men removed. The evident destruction of life of the First World War was far too close, and Priestley moved away from Bradford to London in order to try and maintain a career, or begin a career rather, as a writer. And we can draw some parallels to his war experience. This is a young man, educated, relatively prosperous, who is brought face to face with the realization that in war there is no social status, there's no safety net for those born with a silver spoon in their mouth, and also that the governing classes were, as he saw it, and as many men such as Siegfried Sassoon before him saw it, blithely leading millions to destruction. And yet very little was being gained by this process. And I think we can relate the awakening, if you like, of Priestley's social conscience to that of Wilfred Owen or Siegfried Sassoon during the war, needing to write about what actually was happening in the war rather than to toe a convenient party line of a propagandist. Now, Priestley's writing doesn't dwell on the war. He doesn't, as it were, look back at what he suffered. I believe that what he does is carry his ideas forward into his writing, and the principal idea is that to do with social fairness, social equality. Now, when he settled in London, it was a hard slog to find success, and it wasn't until the end of the 1920s that he was comfortable enough and earning enough money from his writing to be able to concentrate on two areas of great interest, one being drama, as opposed to writing in novels, and the other being his sense of social injustice. And again, at this time, this is something that we see in English writers of this period. It's something we see, for example, in George Orwell, certainly in the 1920s when he was travelling Britain and indeed Europe, to look at the social fabric of our country. Any student reading a text such as Inspector Calls would do very well to read Down and Out in Paris in London or A Road to Wigan Pier, for example, as background material for this sort of writing. Not only that, but you could also begin to look at what Priestley is beginning to write at this time, if you are interested. In early 1930s, 1932, he wrote a play called Roundabout. It's not a play that's often performed now, and is a social comedy, but what perhaps makes it interesting is that it's a social comedy in which a Marxist agitator arrives as a guest at a society house party, I suppose. And whilst it is unformed in the sense that it's not necessarily clear which side Priestley is taking in this debate, it's very clear that he does not view social discussion as something unsuitable for the theatre. The writing is not as targeted, not as direct, perhaps, as that in An Inspector Calls, but it's an interesting forerunner of that later play. It took the arrival of another great conflagration, the Second World War, for Priestley to attain national fame. One hesitates to use the word celebrity, but use national fame. And this came about largely because of the work he was doing for the BBC. At the beginning of the war, Priestley was one of the writers, there were several, who were used by the BBC to carry messages to the home front in short broadcasts. Priestley's were his postscripts, transmitted in 1940 particularly. He actually transmitted his first postscript immediately after Dunkirk and must take some of the responsibility for credit for setting up the idea, the myth, if it is a myth, of the heroic retreat from Dunkirk, and particularly the use of the little ships, the boats, which he describes in that talk as the means for the escape from Europe. One postscript in particular carries huge resonance, though, as we read this play, and that's the one that was delivered on the 6th of October, 1940. It was a talk which, shall we say, interested Winston Churchill sufficiently that Churchill was able to state that he believed his aims in the war and Mr. Priestley's aims were somewhat different. And it's a talk which takes the opportunity to investigate the social fabric of the country at the time of the war. It carries broadly two themes. One, the idea of the idle rich living in hotels, which would be, in Priestley's view, much better used for the housing of those made homeless by the bombing of the East End. And it also carries a message to do with fairness, the idea that at a time such as this, each man should give according to his ability to give, or receive according to his need. If we look at the first of these, the idea of the idle rich, there's interesting contextual resonance reading this play in 2017. When we look at what happened following the Grenfell Tower fire in the summer of this year, several hundred people were made homeless, there were a great number of deaths, a great deal of pain and suffering. In the aftermath, many politicians, particularly politicians of the left, were calling for the idle rich, the wealthy, the oligarchs, who owned large amounts of property in West London, maybe not living in them, maybe these are flats lying empty for most of the year. And the call was that these accommodations should be made available to those made homeless. There was talk of compulsory purchase by the government to make this happen. And I find it interesting that this parallel of, albeit a much smaller, test of blood, fire and anguish in the forms of the Grenfell Tower to that of the war was still calling for the same notion of social fairness. There were empty dwellings which could easily have been used as homes, and this did not happen on either occasion. The other strand, the idea of giving as one is able and receiving as one needs, is a really interesting idea as we read this play, because it links two seemingly unrelated ideas. The first is that it sounds like many a sermon that one might hear in a Christian church. Priestley, certainly in this play, is going to use the idea of sin very effectively. But it also is a paraphrase, if not a direct quotation, of Karl Marx, writing 40 or 50 years earlier and setting out a socialist credo, as he understood it, for a better world. Now, these ideas are timely at this point. Since the Russian Revolution, there has been a need for what became known as Agitprop, in other words, positive identification of socialist and then communist ideals in art as a means to attracting the populace to communism. Communism as an ideal had flourished after the First World War. Millions of people across Europe were so horrified by the carnage wrought by a war that was in many ways a war of the wealthy, landed classes, fought on their behalf by the poor, as it was seen. And communism became at times a very violent birth, an alternative way of life throughout Europe. Britain was spared perhaps the worst excesses of the violence. Certainly there was no great revolution in this country. It's not to say that there wasn't social upheaval and there weren't events like the General Strike. But the running battles that were seen on the streets of, say, Berlin were absent from London. But that's not to say that Priestley wasn't about to play his part. Now, Soviet propaganda, particularly, is a very interesting artistic context in which to view this play, and it's probably worth spending some time looking at Soviet posters of the era, usually embodying the spirit of the hard-working and indomitable proletariat. Soviet artists who were not just encouraged, but instructed how to write their music, their poetry, their books, so that it conformed to a communist ideal, on pain of deportation to Siberia, or worse, should they fail to do so. And we see that in composers, for example, like Shostakovich, having to change his writing and hone his writing so that works would fit in with what was required by a communist state. And Inspector Calls is altogether less confrontational than this. It's not a work of agitprop, and Priestley is able to write something which is, you could argue, quintessentially English. Now, I talked earlier about the idea of it sounding somewhat like a sermon, and I think this is quite deliberate. Rather than depicting the Burlings as a corrupt ruling class, Priestley does something very clever in this play. What we see is, on one level, a group of wealthy, or certainly comfortably off, people gathered for a party, and displaying each of them one or more of the 7 deadly sins, whether it be greed, lust, envy, pride. And we see an everyman figure in terms of the inspector who sets out to counter these sinners in order to save the souls, presumably of the audience. We are the people who will benefit from the instruction that this play gives us. And this format is the format of the medieval mystery play. This format is the format of a drama designed to encourage people to live their lives well. And Priestley adopts it here in a way that presents these ideas to the audience in a manner that they can understand, a manner of the Sunday sermon, not a threatening political diatribe, but an altogether more English event. And that's a phrase I'll use again because it does strike me as this. It's very clear in the opening stage directions of the play that Priestley did not intend the Burlings to be seen as members of any real aristocracy. It's something that I think is a great shame in the recent BBC adaptation with David Thewlis and Ken Stott, that the Burlings' house is so clearly a mansion set away from the town on a village, on a hill rather, and clearly not what Priestley asks for. He asks for a suburban home, quite deliberately. He set the play also deliberately, and we'll talk about this in a moment, in 1912. And he's asked for a home that is recognisable for all those in the theatre. A suburban home. And it's a home in which the clothing, again, detailed. The gentlemen are wearing white tie. And the inspector, when he arrives, will be wearing a lounge suit. That difference is strong anyway. But I think one of the reasons for the suburban home that fascinates me, and particularly the suburban home in conjunction with the white tie, is that the clothing is out of place. It should seem arriviste. It should seem pretentious. If we set this play visually in a huge mansion, we lose that. We lose this idea that when we're sitting in the theatre, anybody sitting alongside us could be Mr. Burling. We ourselves can be Mr. Burling every time we perhaps dress up a little too much for an event because we want to show off a little. We can become Mr. Burling terribly easily. We can't become a member of the aristocracy, and the aristocracy are removed from us. And I say us here in 2017 as, ordinary members of society. But what Priestley does is enable an audience to feel guilt and shame at the same time as they recognise themselves in the characters on the stage. Now, this guilt and shame in 1945 was going to carry into the election that came immediately on the end of the war. In that election, Priestley himself stood as a candidate. And there seems little doubt that the play is part of his attempts, not necessarily organised attempts, but attempts to help the citizens of Britain discover a different path. Churchill had led a war government in which the conservative element had focused, one could argue, totally and only on winning the war at any cost, and left room for the more socially responsible, if you like, certainly ideologically driven left-wing parties, such as the Labour Party, to look at how society could be changed for the better following the end of the war. At the election in 1945, Churchill was removed. He was an old man. And the returning soldiers, it seems, certainly felt that they needed somebody in government who would in some way repay them for the sacrifices, the huge sacrifices that they had given. Each man paid according to his need. And the need, of course, produced two great social changes at that time in terms of a national health service and a national state education policy which enabled all children to receive a free education. It's interesting, this being England, that the great changes of that time, whilst they still exist today and are still part of our social fabric today, indeed some would argue a totally core foundation of our social fabric today, the government of 45 was removed as quickly as 1951, and Churchill, the old man, was re-elected. Nothing changed in terms of those great social developments. It was obvious that the country needed this. But it seems that at that point in the 50s, England actually preferred to go back to what it knew. It's a very English idea that we'll make a change, then we'll go back to something comfortable, and we'll sit there. By that stage, Priestley had become a writer outdated. Like another playwright before him, Terence Rattigan, he'd become a man who was no longer seen as being at the cutting edge of drama. His well-made plays, his drawing room plot lines were no longer seen valid in a world that was now dominated by people like Beckett or John Osborne. Realism now was realism, or there was a real sense of the boundaries of theatre being pushed as far as they could be. Priestley fell out of favour. His message has been got over. The means is now put back to one side. So, I mentioned earlier that Priestley stood at the 45 election, and so he did. Interestingly, though, he stood as an independent in Cambridge. He didn't win. He was heavily defeated by the sitting Tory, but he didn't choose to fight as a member of the Labour Party, which is interesting, I think, on a number of reasons. Again, when we look at this Englishness, because Priestley, over the period perhaps of the 1930s and then into the 40s, had seen the way that the Soviet Union had developed socialism. And what it's very clear that he didn't like was the state control, the centralisation of what he saw as a movement designed to get freedom into society. It's certainly the case that when he travelled in the USSR after the Second World War, when An Inspector Calls was being performed, that he was horrified by much that he saw. He felt that there was much more fairness in England than in the Soviet Union in terms of the way that society worked. He could see that the communist message was actually not a message that was one he wished to follow. He was, if you like, an independent, a non-conformist, social critic. And I think it's in that light that we have to see the play. Now, he set the play quite deliberately in 1912. He's on record as saying that there was no accident. This is the specific period he wished the play to be set, in a specific week in 1912. It's a week that will end with the sinking of the Titanic, which allows us to look at Arthur Burling and see his, well, shall we say his stupidity, though hindsight is, of course, a fabulous thing, when he's calling about the Titanic, this wonderful unsinkable boat, this boat which had become to be, if you like, the metaphor for the capitalist society that Burling supports. In his view, absolutely unsinkable. A great vessel contrived to allow the wealthy to travel in obscene luxury across the sea, built by the labour and toil of those shipyard workers in Belfast. A real indictment, if you like, of the social world. 1912 is also probably the last time comfortably that a society such as that existed in late Edwardian England could see the complacency that perhaps we're shown. It's a time of plenty. It's a time in which Burling can look forward to a complete absence of industrial action or anything of that nature. The clouds of war are not yet real. They're referred to and brushed aside. It's also, therefore, a time in a bubble that encapsulates all that Priestley feels is wrong with the period that he's writing about. It is a rotten and complacent time. When watched from 1945 in particular, we see how clearly this comes across. The inspector will make in his last speech his great prophecy that if men do not learn the message, then they will learn it in fire, blood and anguish. Whether we're watching this play in England, around Europe, or in the Soviet Union, this could hardly be clearer at this stage. The Second World War has just come to its end. Not only that, if you're Russian, you've lived through a civil war that followed the revolution of 1917. In Germany, you've been heavily defeated at the end of the First World War, made little substantial change, gone through the Weimar period of unofficial civil war, if you like, that led to Hitler coming to power. Again, things need to change. England, Britain rather, has seen the First World War. It has seen some social change, notably the enfranchisement of women, but not a great deal. And Priestley, writing in his travel journal, Journeys Around England in the 30s, was able to comment on not only the dilapidated nature of much of rural England, but also the failing nature of much of the industrial heartland of the country. This was, of course, after the Great Depression. And there's no doubt that at this point, England is heading for a significant collapse industrially and in terms of society. It's a collapse which, of course, is interrupted by the arrival of the Second World War. Hardly something to be pleased about, but I think we have to see that. And I think, again, this is something that comes across in the play. The revolution, if it is a revolution, this very English revolution, is much needed at this time. But what's special, I think, about An Inspector Calls, and what makes it so valid today, is the total lack of triumphalism and of a sense of, if you like, political cheerleading. This is a play which engages us on a personal level. Each of us in the audience is able to listen and make up our minds and be led by Priestley's socialist message that something has to change. It's a world in which we are led not by a crank, despite what Arthur Burling might say, but by a sensible man in a suit, towards the realization that the excess and the abuse of power held by many is plainly wrong in a modern and civilized world. It is a wonderful play, it is an important play, and I hope that it is a play that you will get much out of as you read it as part of your course. Thank you for listening.